in your opinion, from a safety perspective, are we now at a point as an industry where ISM should be mandatory for all tugs?
Whether it should be mandatory, I'm not sure. What is important is that we make the step from developing purely design-related safety regulation and translate that into more operational guidance in order to make sure that we really capture what matters most for safety, and that is the actual people and the operations on board. And I believe that a voluntary application of ISM for non-convention vessels to which the code normally doesn't apply is definitely a very good way forward to try to implement a structured approach towards risk assessment, emergency response, and all the things we need to organize around safe towing operations. So whether it should be made mandatory or not, that's a bit open to debate, but definitely it is one of the ways forward which would give a positive contribution.
In your remarks from the podium, you referenced the oil majors and the self-regulating impact they're having on the sector.
Yes, what we see now a lot in offshore operations, in particular for anchor handling, is that oil majors would typically not take on a vessel for hire if that vessel would not have a class-approved stability booklet considering explicitly anchor handling operations. And that is a way for the oil majors to push the industry to make sure that they are compliant with new regulations which are not yet into force, but which are seen as an important way to safeguard the vessels and the crews.
Now, allowing for all of that, is it not the case that it's still widespread that tug vessels are operating without formal safety management systems?
All vessels above 500 gross tons are mandatory required to have ISM, so those vessels will operate with formally approved ISM code compliance. For vessels under 500 gross tons, so it's really the smaller vessels, typically below 30 meters, this is not mandatory, but that does not mean that vessel operators do not have procedures and processes in place to mitigate and regulate themselves. It just is not recognized in a formal manner and therefore it's not audited. And that would be the good thing about the voluntary implementation of ISM code, because it would be regulating everything in a structured manner under a formal document of compliance.
After lunch, we'll be looking at LNG as a fuel. What, to your mind, are the implications for safety if more tugs are LNG fueled?
It's a combination of getting the design right, in particular because tugs are relatively small, so they have a complex operational profile with an LNG system on board, and that needs to be properly mitigated. However, the experience feedback of the first projects we have been doing recently shows that it is definitely technically very well possible to build small vessels with LNG as fuel in a safe manner. The key point is in doing a proper risk assessment and using formal hazard and HAZOP and also failure mode and effect analysis in order to make sure that all the safety hazards are properly addressed, are understood and are properly mitigated. And therefore there is a possibility using technology to use them to find an equivalent safety to prescriptive requirements which are sometimes necessary for application on small ships. Now the second step which is important is, as Govinder also mentioned, and rightfully so, the training of crews on board. How do you deal with LNG as fuel systems in a safe manner, and in particular, what are you going to do if something does not work in accordance with the normal operational plan?
BV has just issued new safety rules and they've been well publicised, including in tug technology and business. So sort of scrolling ahead and looking ahead, have there been any discussions with your colleagues on the class, have there been any discussions with other class societies around standardising tug rules around deck machinery for towing?
Absolutely. The original joint industry project, which was started off in 2008, included Bureau Veritas, Lloyd's Register and ABS. After the GIP, it has been BV who has continued to work with the industry to get to the actual guidelines, but we see now a tendency to reconnect with the other class societies to actually get really to this harmonized level of safety standards of tugs. So I think that's a positive development, and at the same time IACS, the International Association of Class Societies, is developing particular standards for emergency release systems on towing winches, which is a key feature for safety of tugs as well.
As an industry, we're putting a lot of faith in new rules and new tonnage, but of course there's a lot of older tonnage, vintage tonnage operating in our sector. How are we addressing the safety issues around that demographic?
Hopefully, as we have seen and just discussed for the offshore industry, there may be some self-regulating effect in there of phasing out some older vessels potentially even, which would really be non-compliant. But what we also see is that a lot of the older harbour tugs are now being phased out and replaced by more modern tonnage, simply because the merchant ships become bigger, they become faster, and the older fleet is basically no longer capable of properly servicing those big ships.
We've alluded to the rule set that you've recently introduced to the market, and in open discussion you said that the second or an updated version will be live January 2018. What will be the characteristics of version 2.0?
Basically, it's an extension. We have already in place the stability requirements, we have in place the towing equipment requirements, and we're now going to move forward with a voluntary compliance with the harmonized safety equipment standards, which is basically safety equipment on board, it's life-saving appliances, safety radio, navigation and so forth. In particular for tugs below 500 gross tons, to create that level playing field and to help the industry towards compliance with flag states. And in addition, we are working with industry partners towards creating this traffic light system of green, amber and red lights in order to improve the operational guidance to the master on board of the ship, in particular for escort operations.
Based on current safety standards and the technology available, in your opinion, is the industry prepared and gearing up for autopilot, pilotless tugs in the near future? And what sort of time frame are we talking about?
The industry is definitely gearing up, and there is a number of projects ongoing in what is called autonomous tugs or unmanned tugs even. We have to distinguish a little bit between autonomous and unmanned. Unmanned is very easy to understand. Autonomous can have various levels of autonomy. And what I think we will be seeing first is to see an increasing level of automation and control, which will give additional support and guidance to the crew on board, potentially help to have for vessels less crew on board, but not necessarily to go immediately to fully unmanned. However, for several applications with towage, I can see unmanned vessels, unmanned tugs as a viable option. Some interesting challenges are to be found out. How do you make fast? How do you bring a tow line from an unmanned tug to an assisted vessel, for example? But some advantages are also obvious, because if you have a bow-to-bow operation at high speed, that is a relatively safety-critical operation, and having no people on board is definitely an advantage. And in addition, most tugs are multi-role, so they can do firefighting operations. Having no people on board of a firefighting ship in, for example, an LNG incident is also definitely something which makes sense from a safety point of view. How long it will take? Some projects are actually pretty far materialized. Technologically speaking, I think we are able to do it. Whether it will be economically exactly feasible is a bit of a different story. From a regulatory point of view, for local operations, it is not very difficult to work together with innovative flag states to get it off the ground. On international voyage, we are having interesting discussions at the moment with legal representatives on how we are going to have to adapt international legislation in order to enable unmanned and more autonomous technology. But definitely this is something which is looked into.
Finally, for all this talk of safety, new rules, new approaches, history suggests that on a cyclical basis, the industry will have a major safety incident. What, to your mind, will be the characteristics of the next major safety incident in the tug sector?
That is unfortunately difficult to predict, because if we would be able to predict it, we would probably be able to now put measures in place to mitigate that and not let it happen. We are hoping, of course, that with all those new regulations, both on design but especially on operation coming into place, that we can actually avoid such large incidents from happening. But guarantees are difficult to give, as we are still having a lot of human element in the equation. But I do believe that with a more risk-aware approach, we talked just about ISM, we talked about regulation, about operations, we really try to enable the industry as much as we can to actually avoid another big accident from happening in the first place.
So allowing for that, the biggest vulnerability remains the human factor.
For the time being, I would think yes, definitely.